In the summer of 1984, a young woman in North Carolina was attacked in her own home in the dark. And through the worst of it, she did something deliberate and brave. She studied the face of the man hurting her and made herself memorize it so that he could never disappear into a crowd. She remembered it perfectly. She picked him out, stood up in court, and told the jury she had no doubt, and she was the kind of witness no one questions. Composed, careful, certain. She had the wrong man. The person she was so sure of was a stranger who had never set foot in her home, and she had no idea. She would have sworn to his guilt for the rest of her life and been believed if the truth had not come looking for her. Her name was Jennifer Thompson. In the summer of 1984, she was 22, a college student in Burlington, North Carolina, with a bright future ahead of her, when a man broke into her apartment in the dark and raped her at knife point. And in the middle of the worst night of her life, Thompson made a decision that tells you exactly what kind of witness she was. She chose to survive it by studying him, to memorize his face, his voice, every detail she could hold, so that if she got out alive, she could make certain he was caught. That same night, less than a mile away, another woman was raped by what police believed was the same man. Thompson had done everything right. She had been brave and clear-headed and determined to help. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so frightening, because memory does not work the way we all believe it does. In the days after the attack, Thompson sat with detectives and helped build a composite sketch, a face assembled piece by piece from a box of features. These eyebrows that nose this jawline, each chosen from a handful of options laid in front of her. What emerged was not a photograph pulled intact from her mind. It was a construction. Then came a photo array, and here is a detail the jury would never really feel the weight of when Thompson first looked at those photos. She was not sure. She studied them for nearly 5 minutes before tentatively settling on one, saying, in effect, I think this is the guy, not that's him. I think. But once she had chosen that face, the process began quietly to work on her. There is a cruel mechanic in the way lineups function. A witness tends to pick whoever looks most like the person in their memory, even when the true attacker isn't in the lineup at all. And every step after that first choice, a detective's reassurance, a live lineup where she picked the same man again. The simple act of repeating the identification inflates a witness's confidence without improving its accuracy. Step by step, a tentative guess was sanded into total, unshakable certainty. Cotton resembled the sketch. But so it would turn out did the man who actually did it. The face she had settled on belonged to Ronald Cotton, a 22-year-old black man who worked as a dishwasher and who happened to resemble the drawing. Cotton said it wasn't him. He had an alibi, but when police checked it, it fell apart. And it fell apart for the most innocent reason imaginable. He had simply mixed up which weekend he was being asked about. To investigators, a broken alibi looks like a lie. By the time the case reached a jury, there was a composed, certain victim pointing across the courtroom and saying without a flicker of doubt that Ronald Cotton was the man who had raped her. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison plus decades on top of it. Now, here is the moment that should stop you cold. Cotton's first conviction was overturned on a technicality, and he was tried a second time, and by then something had surfaced. In the same prison system sat another man, Bobby Poole, doing time for a string of similar attacks, who resembled Ronald Cotton so closely that the two were mistaken for each other inside the walls. Poole had begun telling other inmates that he was the one who had raped Jennifer Thompson. So at the second trial, the defense brought Poole into the courtroom and stood him in front of her. Thompson looked at the man who had actually attacked her, the real rapist, a few feet away, and said she had never seen him before in her life. Her certainty was so complete that it had erased the face of the man who did it. She was, without knowing it, reconvicting the wrong man to his face, and the jury never even got to wrestle with it. When the defense tried to put Poole forward as the real attacker, the judge refused to let them present him as an alternate suspect. So the one man who was actually guilty stood in that very courtroom, and the system found a way to keep the jury from ever truly considering him. Cotton was convicted a second time. For years afterward, Bobby Poole's confession drifted through the system and changed nothing. The appeals court affirmed the conviction. Poole's admissions to other inmates went nowhere because, in the eyes of the law, a confident eyewitness was close to unbeatable, and Jennifer Thompson was as confident as a witness can be. Ronald Cotton stayed in his cell. It was not until 1995, more than a decade after the attack, in the years when DNA testing was first becoming something the public understood, that his lawyers were finally able to have the old rape kit evidence tested with a tool that had not existed at his trial. The result was absolute. The DNA was not Ronald Cotton's. It was Bobby Poole's. It was the first time in American history that DNA testing both freed an innocent man and named the guilty one in the same stroke. Poole pleaded guilty. The governor of North Carolina pardoned Cotton. And after roughly 11 years in prison for a crime he had nothing to do with, Ronald Cotton walked out a free man. It is worth stopping on what those 11 years actually were. Cotton spent them insisting to anyone who would listen that he had not done this, a young man watching his 20s vanish behind bars for someone else's crime. At one point, he found himself held in the same prison as Bobby Poole, the man who had stolen his life. By his own account, he thought hard about taking revenge, and he chose not to. He decided that becoming the violent man the state had already declared him to be was the one thing that would prove them right. It is a restraint most of us will never be tested enough to imagine. And here is the part that makes this case so unnerving, the thing that separates it from every story of crooked cops and lying witnesses you have ever heard. Nobody lied. Jennifer Thompson did not frame anyone. She was a careful, courageous, devastated woman who told the truth exactly as she genuinely remembered it, and the system took her sincerity and treated it as proof, because memory is not a recording you play back. It is something the brain rebuilds every single time, and it is quietly editable. A sketch, a photo array, an officer's nod, the sheer repetition of a choice. Each of those things wrote over Thompson's memory. A little more until the face of an innocent man felt to her exactly like the truth. The most dangerous evidence in the courtroom was never a lie. It was honest certainty. And Ronald Cotton's case is not a freak event. Mistaken eyewitness identification has turned out to be the single leading cause of wrongful convictions, later overturned by DNA, a factor in something like 7 out of every 10 of them. His story became one of the cases that forced police departments to change how they run lineups, to stop steering witnesses, to record a witness's confidence at the moment of the very first identification before it can be inflated by everything that comes after. Those reforms exist because of what one honest, certain mistake did to two people's lives. So sit with what that means. There was no villain here, no corruption, no coercion, no hidden agenda. Everyone in this case was more or less trying to do the right thing, and an innocent man still lost 11 years of his life, while the real rapist stayed free long enough to keep hurting people. That is how low the bar can be. You do not need a bad actor to send the wrong person to prison. You only need certainty and a system that keeps mistaking certainty for evidence. This is the gentlest version of the failure. We are going to look at the one with no one to blame. And it should already frighten you. Because if it can happen when everyone is trying to do the right thing, imagine what happens when they are not. Ronald Cotton received $110,000 from the state, took a job fittingly at the very laboratory whose DNA test had freed him, married, had a daughter, and bought a piece of land to build a life on. And 2 years after his release, Jennifer Thompson asked to meet him. She had spent those 2 years barely able to function under the weight of what her certainty had done. She has described learning the truth as the ground opening up beneath her, and she went to him expecting nothing at all. He forgave her. The two of them became friends, and they have spent the years since traveling the country together. The woman who was raped, and the man wrongly convicted of it, warning judges and juries and police about the one thing that ruined them both. How completely and how sincerely a human being can be certain of something that simply is not true. Ronald Cotton's is the gentlest story we have, and it still ends with Grace, a victim, and an innocent man who somehow found their way to forgiveness. Hold on to that, because the next one offers none of it. Cotton was convicted because good people made an honest mistake. But what happens when the people running the case are not making a mistake at all? When they know the evidence is thin and they build it anyway because a frightened town is demanding someone to blame, and the easiest someone is already standing right there. On a Saturday morning in the summer of 1986, a man in a small Alabama town was doing the most ordinary thing imaginable, standing in his own yard at a fish fry, surrounded by family and neighbors, selling sandwiches to the people who came by. Dozens of them would remember being there. Dozens of them would remember seeing him. At that same hour, 11 miles away, a young woman was shot to death behind the counter of a dry cleaner's. The man at the fish fry had nothing to do with it. He had never been there, he did not know her, and a yard full of people could swear to exactly where he had stood all morning. None of that would matter. Within 2 years, he would be sitting on Alabama's death row, and the strangest part is that when they first put him there, the state had not yet bothered to try him at all. His name was Walter McMillian, though nearly everyone called him Johnny D. He was 45, a black man who had built himself up from nothing in Monroeville, Alabama, hauling pulpwood out of the forest until he owned his own equipment and ran his own modest timber business. He had no criminal record. He was by every account an ordinary working man. The young woman shot dead at the dry cleaners was Rhonda Morrison, 18 years old. White, a college student admired all over town. She had been found behind the counter of Jackson Cleaners on a November morning in 1986 shot 3 times. Her murder horrified Monroeville, and it kept horrifying it because for 7 months the police had nothing. No suspect, no arrest, just a grieving community and a newly elected sheriff taking more and more heat for failing to solve the worst crime the town could remember. And there is one detail about this particular town you need to hold on to. Monroeville, Alabama, is a hometown of Harper Lee. It is the place that inspired To Kill a Mockingbird, the great American novel about a black man falsely accused of assaulting a white woman in a justice system that bends itself to convict him anyway. The town sells that story to tourists to this day. It was about to live it. So why Walter McMillian? Not because of evidence, there was none tying him to Rhonda Morrison. He came onto the radar for a reason that had nothing to do with the murder at all. Sometime before McMillian, a married black man had had an affair with a white woman. In that town in those years, that was the unforgivable thing, a line you did not cross, and it had already marked him as a man the community was prepared to believe the worst of. When the police needed someone to answer for a white girl's death, a black man who had broken that particular taboo was the path of least resistance. But to convict him, they needed a witness. They found one in a man named Ralph Myers, a white career criminal badly scarred from burns, with a drug problem and a murder charge of his own waiting in a neighboring county. There was only one obstacle. Myers told the police plainly and repeatedly that he had never met Walter McMillian and knew nothing about the Morrison murder, so they made him change his story. Myers was moved onto death row into a cell near the electric chair close enough to grasp in full what the room was for and what it would do to a man. And he was given to understand that the same thing was waiting for him unless he gave them McMillian. A man who had insisted he knew nothing finally broke and began to say what the police wanted to hear. The state built its murder case by threatening its own witness with the very death penalty that case would go on to demand. Now look at how upside down this had become. Walter McMillian was placed on Alabama's death row to await his trial, not after a conviction, but before it. For over a year before a jury had heard a single word, the state housed him among the condemned, as though the verdict were a formality still to be filled in. And when the trial came in 1988, that is more or less what it was. It was held not in Monroeville, but in a neighboring whiter county before a jury that was nearly all white. The state had no physical evidence, none. What McMillian had was an alibi, and not a thin one on the morning Rhonda Morrison was killed. He had been at that fish fry at his own home, his truck up on a jack in the yard, surrounded by people. A dozen witnesses could place him there miles from the dry cleaners. An entire community stood ready to testify that he could not have done it. The jury listened to the coerced testimony and to the alibi and deliberated for roughly 3 hours before convicting him. Then the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison, and the judge overrode them. Alabama law let him do it. Set aside the jury's call for mercy and condemned Walter McMillian to death. Stop and add up what that verdict was actually built on. No physical evidence. A yard full of alibi witnesses. A star witness who had to be threatened with execution before he would talk. Those are not the ingredients of an honest mistake. An honest system cannot reach a guilty verdict from that pile. It can only get there by deciding in advance what the answer will be, and then bending everything toward it. This was not a case that went wrong. It was a case that was built on purpose by people who wanted it closed more than they wanted it true. The town needed a murderer, and Walter McMillian was the cheapest one on offer. He was not the only person made to lie for it. A jailhouse informant testified that he had seen McMillian's distinctive low-rider truck pulling away from the cleaners. Except McMillian's truck had not been converted into a lowrider until months after the murder. The man had described something that could not have existed yet. He had been rewarded for the testimony, as had others with money or with charges that quietly went away. The whole case was a structure of paid and pressured lies, and for a long time it held. Then a young lawyer named Bryan Stevenson, who had founded what became the Equal Justice Initiative, took the case and kept at it even as he and his office received threats for daring to. When Stevenson dug into the state's own files, he found what had been buried: Ralph Myers's earliest statements, the ones where he swore he knew nothing about Walter McMillian. Statements the prosecution had hidden from the defense. He found the deals behind the other witnesses. One by one, the lies came apart, and Myers took the stand and recanted, describing how he had been pushed to frame a man he had never known. And even then, the system did not simply let go. Courts denied relief, unconvinced. The recantation, the hidden evidence, the absent proof was somehow still not enough. Stevenson's point about the whole ordeal was that it had been remarkably easy to put an innocent man on death row and agonizingly hard to get him off it. It took a national news program carrying the case to the country, and finally the state's own Bureau of Investigation re-examining the murder and concluding that Walter McMillian had not done it before. In 1993, his conviction was thrown out, and the charges were dropped. He walked off death row after nearly 6 years of living a few doors from the room they had built to kill him for a crime the evidence said from the very first day he could not have committed. And notice how different this is from the story we just heard. Ronald Cotton was convicted by an honest mistake by people trying their best. There was no honest mistake here. This was coercion, perjury, hidden evidence, and an old familiar hatred assembled deliberately into the shape of a guilty man. The wrong person did not slip through the cracks. He was chosen and built and very nearly killed. Walter McMillian's case did not stay a local tragedy. It became one of the first death row exonerations of the modern era, and a national alarm bell. If a man could be put here on coerced lies and held for years while the truth sat in a file, how many others were there? In the decades since, more than 150 people have been freed from death rows across the country after being proven innocent. McMillian's was among the cases that forced the country to admit those numbers were real, that the machine did not just occasionally err, but could be made on purpose to condemn a man it knew nothing real about. When the sheriff had first arrested him, McMillian had told him plainly where he had been at the fish fry in front of everyone. He was not believed. Years later, after it all came apart, an official would describe the whole thing as a horrible mistake that had simply mushroomed out of control, as though no one had chosen any of it, as though it had grown on its own. But the damage was not a thing that could be waved off. McMillian went home. Yet the years on death row had done something to him that never healed. In his final years, he sank into a dementia that kept dragging him back there, convinced over and over that he was once again waiting to die. He passed away in 2013. And there is one last injustice folded quietly inside this one easy to miss. For all the years the state was so certain it had Rhonda Morrison's killer, the person who actually shot her, was never found. A town that demanded someone pay got exactly that someone, just not the one who did it. Ronald Cotton walked free. Walter McMillian walked off death row with little time to spare. Both had years stolen from them, but both had a life to walk back into. In the end, both stories are about a system that was wrong and was eventually forced to admit it. The last story is the one where that admission comes too late. There is a point past which being wrong can no longer be undone, where the cost is not years, but everything. And what should stop you in the case you are about to hear is how much warning the system was given, and how little it mattered. In a small wooden house in Corsicana, Texas, a young father and his 3 little girls were asleep one winter morning, the youngest of them still a baby. The father woke to smoke. He made it out of the house. His daughters did not. It was the worst thing that can happen to a person, and it should have been the whole of the story. A house fire, a grieving father, an unbearable accident. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because when investigators picked through the burned-out rooms, they read something in the patterns of the char, and they reached a conclusion that turned a tragedy into something else. They decided the fire had not been an accident. They decided this father had set it on purpose with his children inside. He swore he had not. And the question of who was right would take more than a decade to answer, and it would come down in the end to something deceptively small. Whether the marks burned into that floor meant what everyone was so sure they meant. The father's name was Cameron Todd Willingham. He was 23, an unemployed mechanic, and no one's idea of a model citizen. But on the morning of December 23rd, 1991, he was a young man whose 3 daughters had just died 2 days before Christmas. There was the toddler Amber and the 1-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron. His wife had been out that morning. Willingham escaped with burns to his hands and face and could not get back inside and stood in the yard while the house was lost. Whatever else this story becomes, do not lose hold of that. 3 small children died, and a family was destroyed, and that part is simply terribly true. The fire should have been treated as what it almost certainly was, a catastrophe. Instead, it was worked as a crime scene. The investigators who examined the ruins believed they could read the history of the blaze in the wreckage in pooled puddle-shaped scorch marks on the floor, in cracked and crazed window glass, in char that dipped low along the boards and seemed to trace a path toward the door. They counted up a list of such signs, and to their eyes every one of them pointed the same way, to a liquid accelerant splashed through the house and set alight. The deputy state fire marshal who led the analysis, Manuel Vasquez, would describe finding around 20 separate indicators of arson, and would speak as though the fire itself had confessed to him. The fire, he was sure, did not lie. And if the fire had been set deliberately, there was only one suspect who had been inside it, the father. In a matter of days, Cameron Todd Willingham went from a man who had lost everything to a man accused of slaughtering his own children. There was a second pillar to the case, and it was just as fragile. While Willingham sat in jail awaiting trial, another inmate, a man named Johnny Webb, came forward to say that Willingham had confessed the killings to him behind bars. It was the kind of jailhouse informant testimony that juries find damning, and that so often later turns out to have been bought, and Webb's would be no exception. He would eventually take it back, and the favors he had received would come to light. But in 1992, it was enough. On the strength of the fire, science, and the snitch, Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of murdering his 3 daughters and sentenced to death. Here is the problem, and it is the heart of everything. The fire science that convicted him was not science at all. The indicators, the investigators trusted the poor patterns. The crazed glass, the low char on the floor were closer to folklore handed down. Through the trade as though they were laws of nature, they had never been tested. And when, in the years that followed, people finally did test them, they fell apart. It turns out that when a room burns long enough, it reaches a point called flashover, where everything in it ignites at once, and a fire that has flashed over produces exactly the puddle-shaped burns and the low char that investigators had been reading for decades as the signature of a poured accelerant. The crazed glass they trusted is caused not by intense heat, but by water hitting hot glass by the fire hoses used to put the blaze out. The very next year after Willingham's conviction, the national standard for fire investigation was rewritten around this new understanding. Almost everything the men in Corsicana had been so sure of was wrong. They had not necessarily lied. They had believed completely in a method that did not work, and a man had been sentenced to die on the strength of their certainty. As for what actually started the fire, the likeliest explanations were heartbreakingly ordinary: a space heater or one of the children near it. The kind of household accident that takes homes and lives somewhere every winter. There was no mystery that required a murderer to solve it. There was only a fire, and the system had every chance to catch the error before it was too late. In the weeks before the execution, one of the country's foremost fire scientists, a Cambridge-trained chemist named Gerald Hurst, reviewed the evidence in the case. His conclusion was not hedged or careful. He found not one valid sign that this fire had been deliberately set. It was, he said, a classic accidental fire, just a fire. His report was delivered to the office of the governor of Texas in the hours before the lethal injection was scheduled. The state of Texas executed Cameron Todd Willingham anyway on February 17, 2004. He went to his death still insisting he was innocent. The strongest evidence that he might be telling the truth was sitting that very day on a desk in the governor's office. Now follow this all the way to the bottom, because it is worse than a wrongful execution, and most people never let themselves finish the thought. If the fire was an accident, and the best fire science we have says it was, then no one said it. If no one said it, there was no arson. And if there was no arson, then there was no murder. There was never a crime at all, which means the state did not merely execute a man who might have been innocent of killing his children. It took a father whose 3 daughters had died in front of him in an accidental fire, the most shattering loss a person can suffer, and 13 years later, it killed him for it. I want to be fair to the whole picture, because this case is often told too simply. Cameron Todd Willingham was not a sympathetic man. He had a record of violence and trouble. His own ex-wife would later say she had come to believe he was guilty. I am not going to pretend any of that away. But a person can be an ugly human being and still be innocent of a specific crime. And those are two different questions. The character of the man is one. Whether the fire was arson is another. And on that second question, the physical evidence is not seriously in dispute. It is worth noting, too, how the picture of Willingham as a monster was painted in the first place at trial. A prosecution expert told the jury that his heavy metal posters and his skull and serpent tattoos marked him as a sociopath capable of killing his children. It was the same confident, evidence-free certainty as the fire science. A young man's taste in music and ink read aloud in a courtroom as proof of murder. A celebrated investigation by the reporter David Grann later took the case apart pillar by pillar. The snitch recanted, and even a Texas state commission would go on to acknowledge that the fire science used to convict him was flawed. The case did not fall apart because anyone felt sorry for Willingham. It fell apart because the thing it was built on was never true. And what makes it harder still is what the state did when the doubt arrived. When a Texas Forensic Commission moved to examine the discredited science in the case, the governor replaced several of its members shortly before a scheduled hearing, and the hearing was called off. To a great many people watching it did not look like an institution searching for the truth. It looked like one protecting itself from having to say a thing it could not take back, that it had put an innocent man to death. It is tempting to call Willingham a single freak tragedy. He is not. Junk forensic science discredited arson theory, but also bite mark analysis. Certain hair comparisons and more has helped send people to prison and to death rows for decades, each case wrapped in the authority of an expert who was sure. Willingham's is simply the clearest, best documented case we have of where that road can end, not in a freed man with a story of redemption, but in a grave. Since the 1970s, more than 190 people have been freed from American death rows after being shown to be innocent, caught like McMillian before the end, the unbearable question. Willingham's case leaves hanging is the obvious one: how many were not caught in time? And this is where our three stories arrive at their end, and at the worst place they can go. Ronald Cotton was convicted by an honest mistake, and he was freed. Walter McMillian was framed on purpose, and he was pulled back from the edge. Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted by a false certainty dressed up as science, and there was no pulling him back because the sentence had already been carried out. This is the line past which a wrongful conviction stops being something the system can apologize for and undo. The most dangerous lie was never which man did it. It is a system so certain of its own verdict that it would sooner kill a person than admit it might be wrong, and then call that killing justice. 3 little girls died in a house fire 2 days before Christmas. That was the tragedy. Everything after it, the investigation, the trial, the 13 years, the gurney was something added on top of it by people who were sure. After the execution, Willingham's body was cremated, and his parents quietly carried his ashes to the cemetery and scattered them over the graves of the daughters he had been accused of murdering, reassembling in the only way left to them the family the state had insisted he destroyed. The discredited fire science that killed him is now taught to investigators as a lesson in how wrong certainty can be. The lesson arrived. It simply arrived 13 years too late for the man it was learned on. Johnson here. Before the last story, a quick word, because it is the one that has stayed with me the longest and the hardest one I have ever put together. If these matter to you, subscribing and leaving a comment is what keeps the channel going and tells me which cases to dig into next. Okay, the last one, and it is the one that can never be taken back.